Based on what you remember, what was early life for you when you were a child, living with your parents?
I couldn't identify with their values. I could not, so I tried to reach them, but I couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
And then as I grew older, I became a Boy Scout. I didn't learn anything from that. And then it was the Great Depression that really helped me. Of course, there were people up on soapboxes talking about all kinds of new ideas. And I went from one to the other. There was the American Nazi Party with the American flag and the Nazi flag. And I listened to them, then I listened to the socialists, and then I found myself standing in front of a communist. He said, "Beat it, kid." I said, "No." He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want to hear what communism is from a communist, not a Republican or a Democrat." He says, "You can stay." So when he got through speaking, I raised my hand, I said, "I want to ask you 1,000 questions." So he said, "You have to go to the YCL." I said, "What's that?" He said, "The Young Communist League." So I went there, and there were kids from 10 years to 16, and they were reading good books, like Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Do you know the book?
No.
Anyway, they were reading very deep books for kids, and I thought they were smarter than the usual kid. Then when I got through listening to their speaker, I said, "How are you going to prevent corruption when you get into power?" They said, "Well, when that time comes, we'll work on it." I said, "How are you going to house the millions of people?" They said, "Well, when that time comes, we'll work on it." I said, "You should have a technical branch of the Communist Party and work on those details." He says, "You're deviating from the teachings of Marx. You'll have to leave." I said, "I'm not here to disrupt you. I'm here to give you ideas." He says, so the vice president of the Young Communist League, a kid about 17, stood up and he said, "Let's hear him out." He says, "You too, out." So they chased us both out. I would say the guy was dumb, because I wasn't there to hurt them. I was there to give them advice. Anyway, he misunderstood that, and I was friends with this guy for years thereafter. Listening to all those ideas, they were never completed. The details were not there. The communists didn't know exactly what they wanted, so they had banks and they had money and they had social stratification, and the people that disagreed with, they sent to Siberia, which is wrong.
Yeah.
I couldn't talk to this guy. He was dumb. I wouldn't say that's true of all communists, but I haven't met any yet that could understand this.
Okay.
I did not come at them with ego or anything. I
Yeah.
just came at them with information. So that was the Depression was the time. Now I went to visit a friend of mine. I think I told you. His name was Henry Berliner. He owned the Berliner Joyce Aircraft Company. And the government agents were there. They said, "We're taking over your factory because you haven't paid taxes for years." So I have no orders for airplanes. There's a depression on. The agent said, "We're still taking it." He says, "Take it, because I can't even sell it." Do you understand that?
Yes.
And there was one man that owned several apartment houses, and he told me he was starving. I said, "Why don't you sell one of your apartment houses?" He said, "I can't sell it. It's a depression." And
Nobody would buy it?
Get relief.
Mm-hmm. Nobody would buy it?
No, because they had nobody renting.
Because people didn't have the money to buy it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So he was starving, and he couldn't get relief because he owned apartments.
Wow.
And I understood that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I looked at it as the rules of the game were not good. After the war, Fortune magazine did an article called "Arms and the Men," and it exposed that DuPont had holdings in Fortune, which is a business magazine.
Yeah.
And it was anti the U.S. in the sense that we weren't ethical.
Mm-hmm.
And while soldiers were dying, he couldn't bomb the munition dump. He couldn't understand that. But he was the guy that told me he was a member of technocracy.
Mm-hmm.
So he said, you'd like it because it advocates science for government. So I went to their meeting and I joined up right away because I liked what I heard. But then I think I told you there were no Negroes.
Yeah.
So I asked the chief engineer of technocracy, why there are no Negroes? He says, let them start their own section. That bothered me. Then I said, how come there's no Orientals? He said, Jaque, the Oriental mind can't grasp technology. I said, you're talking about the first generations years ago. Once they're acclimated, anybody can grasp it. He says, not true. So I resigned from the organization because I could not support any kind of racial discrimination. Now, I liked some aspects of technocracy. And Scott, the chief engineer, wouldn't accept anything from me except total conscription. Which I said, if you conscript the lives of people to save a country, if they're willing to put up their life, you shouldn't have to have people buy war bonds. You have to conscript all the money to bring Johnny home faster, not depending on people buying war bonds.
Mm-hmm.
You have to conscript all the war industries so no one makes profit out of war. That seemed right to me. And Scott agreed, and they took that idea, which I suggested. That's the only thing. And they talked of building canals across the country, but they didn't talk of how it'll be used to move buildings or anything. I added all that. So I was influenced by technocracy, and I was influenced by a guy named Edward Bellamy. You ever hear of him?
No.
He wrote a book called Looking Backwards.
Mm-hmm.
And in that book, he describes a new social system through an analogy called the parable of the water tank. It's a man who knew where there was water, and he'd tell people for every gallon they bring, he would give them a glass of water. So they brought water and they filled his water tank, kept filling it up, and when it was full, he laid them off.
Yeah.
And that's the description of the money system.
That's what it is.
With a water tank. It's called the parable of the water tank. He said if after about 2 or 3 months the water went down a little bit, so he hired more people. But an inventor came home and said if you cover the top, it won't evaporate. So he laid off more people. And pretty soon the people took over the water tank. And they all had water without being exploited. That's essentially, he talked about that as opposed to socialism or revolution. He tried to show what things were like. I think his basis was religion. He was a very religious person, and he thought that would be a better system. So the parable of the water tank was a bestseller in America. A book called Looking Backward. Edward Bellamy, written about 50, 60 years ago. It started a lot of people socially thinking. It helped me a little bit. The water tank was a good example. It didn't say communism, socialism. It just gave an analogy of the water tank.
How old were you when you read that book?
About 14.
Oh, so that made you think a little bit about the world a little different.
Yes. It didn't come out of me.
Yeah.
It was put into me by experience.
Mm-hmm.
Then in hitchhiking across the country...
Why did you hitchhike? Why did you hitchhike across the country?
Because airplanes drop pamphlets. Come to California, there's lots of jobs.
Oh, okay.
So, first, it was so cold in the winter that the landlord didn't put enough coal in to heat the houses. So my mother used to bang on the pipes to try to get him to put more coal in. And I was always freezing at night. First thing I did was hitchhike to Florida, because my cousin came in a white suit in the wintertime. And how come you? I said, I just got off the plane. I came from Florida where it's warm all the time. And I thought, gee, that's great. So I started to hitchhike toward California. When I got to Georgia, there was an old man shuffling with all his worldly goods on the end of a stick.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I've done? And he was shuffling real slow. So at night, this is about 10 o'clock at night, I called out to him. I said, sir, and I spoke. I said, can I carry your stuff? Because I felt he was having a tough time. And he didn't answer me. So I called out again. I said, sir, can I carry your stuff? And he turned around slowly, and he had elephant man disease. You know what that is?
Your face is
called
deformed.
acromegalia.
Mm-hmm.
And it scared the shit out of me because I didn't know what that was as a kid.
Yeah.
Anyway, when I got into Georgia, I went to the police department and I said, I have no place to sleep. Can I sleep in a prison cell? They said, only if we fingerprint you and photograph you. I said, why do you do that? We want to make sure you're not wanted for anything. So they photographed me, fingerprinted me, and they put me in a cell that was filthy. Mm-hmm. There was shit all over the toilet bowl, and the bedding was on the floor and it was dirty. So I sat in the corner of the cell, and I heard somebody yelling in the next cell in pain. Oh, you know. So I looked and there's a dull red light, and there was this old man with acromegalia. Mm. So I banged on the prison bars. I called for the orderly. I said, there's an old man in the cell. He doesn't belong in prison. He belongs in a hospital. He's a no-good bum. I said, but the man is sick. He needs help. He's a no-good bum. Don't bother me anymore. I felt the guy had no soul. Mm-hmm. You know, he had no feelings.
Why did they arrest him? Why did they arrest a man with the...
Vagrancy.
Vagrancy?
If you didn't have $25, you were arrested as a vagrant.
Really?
And then they lease out the prisoners to the local farms.
Oh, wow.
And for slave labor.
Slave labor.
You know, that's America. And
that's in what year was that? 65 years ago.
65, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I used to walk over the Brooklyn Bridge to Battery Park. Do you know New York at all?
Yes, I live in New York, yeah.
I walked over the Brooklyn Bridge, and I saw a man, appeared to be an alcoholic with an empty bottle of liquor, sleeping on the walkway. And then a police car came. Did I tell you this story?
Yes. Well, they dumped him into the river.
They threw him off the bridge. And I said to myself, boy, this shit's got to go. Mm-hmm. I didn't like policemen because they'd pull up on a bunch of blacks, Afro-Americans gambling, shooting dice, you know, and they'd pull up and the blacks would run away, leave their money, and they pocketed the money.
Wow.
The policemen.
You saw that happen?
Oh, yeah. I saw them. And the first experience with policemen, there was a shoe store that went out of business. And the doors were open, and the shoe boxes had no shoes in them. They were just empty boxes. So I went in that store. The doors were wide open. I went in, and I made cities out of the boxes on the floor. I was building up cities. And a policeman walked in. He said, what are you doing in private property? I said, I'm making these cities. He says, you're a criminal. You're entering private property. I said, I'm not. I just wanted to make cities out of the boxes. So he slapped me, and I thought this man was stupid. As a kid, I knew that.
How old were you when you were doing that?
Oh, about 12 or 13.
Oh, wow.
He said, I'm going to talk to your father. I know your father, and tell him you have criminal tendencies, because you're in private property. He talked to my father. My father says, you're wrong.
Of course.
Anyway, it didn't work out. And anyway, and then I was hitchhiking. I told you about the fat lady. Mm-hmm. I got in the car and she let me off in Texas. And there I met a kid my age. I think I was 14 or so, or 13 and a half. And the kid says, where are you going? I said, I'm going to California. He says, so am I. So we were walking toward the freight yard because it's too hard to get a lift. I want to ride the freight train. He said, yeah, I've ridden the freight train. I know all about how to get to California. So I said, that's great. Then the guy drove up in a brand new car and he said, would you kids like to make a buck? So that the other kid said, yeah, I'd like to make a buck. I want you to tell my girlfriend I can't see her tonight. I have an appointment. So give her this note and she'll give you a package. So all he did is he went across the way. She was a cashier in the movie theater. And the note said, the kid didn't see this, give me all the cash you have or I'll blow your brains out. I got a gun aimed at you. Now the kid didn't know that. And the police car, she screamed, the cashier, when she saw the note. And called the police and they came and they arrested the kid. And I said, boy, that kid was completely innocent. But I was in rags myself. Mm-hmm. I had no way of helping him. Mm-hmm. I couldn't even say anything because they would have arrested me. Mm-hmm. And that was the end of that kid. Then I got on the freight train. There were about 500 kids on the train that left their homes because their parents were evicted and they were going to California trying to get a job. So one of the kids got up in the train and said, hey, railroad dicks are coming. So they all started to jump off the train. And I said, what the hell, I'm going to stay. So I stayed in the train, and a railroad dick shined a flashlight on me. He said, what are you doing in this train? I'm trying to get to California to get a job. He said, stay low. He wasn't bad. Mm-hmm. That was the only time he didn't look like a policeman. He looked like an average guy. Mm-hmm. Anyway, when I got to California, I got to a farm. They said, will you work for 10 cents an hour? Will you work for 13 cents an hour? And they took the lowest bidders. Hmm. It wasn't jobs in California. Yeah. Then I went to an aircraft factory. The guy says, do you have experience? I said, no. He says, we can't hire you. So I showed him some of my drawings, and he said, you're hired. I said, what do you want me to do? Just think of new ideas. Well, I can't think of military ideas like machine guns or things like that. He said, that's okay. I can only work on safety devices. I didn't want to work on military. I know how, but I wouldn't. Yeah. So I worked at the aircraft factory, and after 3 weeks, he said to me, you've made more contributions in 3 weeks than the history of aviation. So I said, thank you. I want you to meet the chief aerodynamicist. That's the guy who studies how air flows over wings. Mm-hmm. I told him that I didn't agree. Maybe I told you this. I didn't agree with the Bernoulli principle. You know what that is?
It's
air flowing over the top of a wing creates a decreased pressure. Okay. And more lift comes to the top of the wing than the bottom. So I built a test wing. And I figured if you can deflect air off at an angle and create a vacuum here, deflecting the air, sucks the air out of here, you're going to receive a downward pressure in order to deflect the air up that way. Mm-hmm. So you can't get anything for nothing. Mm-hmm. So I said, I don't agree with that aspect of the Bernoulli principle. He told that to the aerodynamicist. And he walked over to me and says, I don't even want to talk to you if you don't accept the Bernoulli principle. That's the first time I ran into a scientist that was bigoted. Mm. That didn't say, what is your theory? What do you disagree with? If he was a scientist, he tried to help me and say, kid, you got it wrong, this is way wrong. But he said, I don't even want to talk to you.
He had an ego.
Yeah, so the guy named Ford, the guy that hired me, was a chief draftsman. He said, he's a hard head. I predicted that the plane they were building for France had the tendency to go into a spin. And I told that to Ford. And Ford told that to the aerodynamicist. And the aerodynamicist came over to me and he says, I'm sick and tired of your ideas. I don't want you to say anything anymore. Mm-hmm. So anyway, the plane went into a flat spin and crashed. And Ford said, we're in now. We were both asked to resign. And he said, everything you think of belongs to Douglas Aircraft Company. Did you know that? I said, no. Well, now you know it. Hmm. So everything I thought of was not in my name, it was in the name of the Northrop Division of Douglas.
Oh, so they took your ideas.
Always.
Oh.
Whenever you work for GE, they say, and now GE brings you.
Oh, yeah, even though
But
it's
they
not
get it
theirs.
from some guy worked in his garage and made the first refrigerator.
Yeah.
You know? But it's owned by GE.
Because somebody just has the money to patent it and use
Yes,
it.
I didn't have any money.
Yeah.
After I resigned from that company, I worked there about a year and a half. And then this guy that was a pilot told me about technocracy. And then what I told you about, technocracy followed that. I used to lecture in my home on what I didn't agree with. And I said, I better design a social system that includes everybody. Otherwise, I read that we spend most of our money on ornaments. And if we spend it on educating kids that didn't have money to go to college, that would be better. The more engineers and technicians you made, the richer the nation.
Yes.
And if you keep people ignorant, your nation will eventually fall. So I began to preach that philosophy to my friends, and they all accept. I took away their religion, of course, to do that. I had to do that. I educated them out of religion.
And how old were you when that happened?
Well, 14 or 15,
15.
all around that age.
And how old were you when you were working for the aerodynamics department? How old were you then?
Gee, I think I was about 18.
18, okay.
About.
Mm-hmm.
As time went on, my friends did whatever they could. They talked a little bit about the system, but they got pushed back by normal people.
Yeah.
They didn't have techniques. And I developed over a period of time better ways of presenting the ideas. So most people seem to go along with it. I then formulated meetings at my home, and I began to talk about human behavior, because I noticed my friends that were brought up as Italians, they were Catholics, and they were rigid, they were hard to change, but I changed them. Some of my friends were Irish. They were professionally Irish. You know what I mean by that? Did you know that Lincoln was Irish? You know, all kinds of stuff. So I figured they came to this country because of the Irish famine of potatoes. They were starving to death. They came in, they worked for one half what Americans would work for. And Americans used to beat them up because they took their jobs away.
They kicked him out of line.
Yes, and then the Italians came, they worked for less than the Irish, and the Irish used to beat up the Italians, and the Italians used to beat up the Irish.
Yeah.
So all racism was based upon differential advantage.
From scarcity.
Yes.
Emerging from scarcity.
Is that clear to you?
Yes.
Okay. So I then realized that the Irish all spoke with a brogue, an Irish brogue. How are you, lad? It's a fine Irish boy, you know. And they all spoke like that. And I know where they came from. And they had Irish values. They had songs they used to sing, you're Irish and you're beautiful, beautiful because you're Irish. A lot of songs like that, nationalism. And the Arabs in my neighborhood all talked about the Arabs being wiser than the average person, you know. They always talked like that. They used to say to me, you can learn a lot from the Arabs. So I read what I could, but I couldn't learn much.
Yeah.
It was mostly science. I had meetings at my house, and the people used to line up. I charged them $3 each, if they can afford it. If they can't, nothing. So they came to my house, and I taught them about human behavior.
How old were you then?
When I began, about 20.
Oh, okay.
I taught about human behavior, and the American Psychological Association found out that people would come to me as alcoholics and drug addicts, and they'd confess that they were drug addicts, and I'd help them out of it by taking their attention off themselves, putting it onto the social
system. Yeah.
It's when you get into self-pity, I'll not amount to anything, I'm not getting anywhere. I took that away from them and gave them something to believe in, a better life for all people. And they liked that. And they told other people about it. And then they told alcoholics about it. And the alcoholics began coming to my sessions. First, one group. And they said, we leave our problems over to God and He'll handle it. And I took the God away, and they turned me over to the FBI. Said, Fresco, speaks against the country. Is he a bad person? Later on, the FBI knocked at my lab door. They said, we've come to investigate you. I said, it's about time. You know, so they said, you're more patriotic than anybody we know. Can you recommend any good books to read?
Wow.
So the FBI at that time was different, and they learned a lot. I taught them a little bit, but I had no credentials.
Yeah.
I left school at an early age, like 13 and a half or 14. I told you about the principal, didn't I?
The principal, no.
He put his arm around me, says,
Oh, the principal, yes, yes.
and then he said, what's the matter with American teaching? I said, it's just awful. The teacher said, that's wrong, and words like that's wrong doesn't tell me anything.
Yeah.
He said, we use a C to spell cat, not a K. That's all she had to tell me, not that's wrong, that's not what I told you. That doesn't tell me anything.
Right.
So I became conscious of language and how bad it was and how little people talk to each other. They talk at one another.
At one another, yeah.